Good morning and welcome. I'm Burçin Ünel. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Integrity, and I'm delighted to have you all here. And I would like to welcome you to today's conference, Accelerating the Energy Transition. We're delighted to be co-hosting this conference with the Urban Future Lab. Since 2009, the Urban Future Lab at NYU Tandon School of Engineering has been shaping a cleaner and greener future. As New York State's longest-running clean tech incubator, the original ACRE program has incubated over 70 companies to propel climate tech innovation forward, resulting in several impressive exits. Over $1.65 billion raised in private capital, and an industry-leading 88% company survival rate, and over 4,000 jobs created. UFL currently runs 6 programs, and their profit incubator has helped their climate tech companies raise $2.3 billion to date. And we're delighted to be co-hosting the conference with them. And we're excited to have you here. It is especially great to see a full house here in person. And we will be discussing some of the most pressing issues in environmental and energy policy today. And we're going to talk about how to get things done faster. Today's panels include some prominent policymakers and experts around the country, and I really look forward to hearing what they have to say. This is a particularly exciting event for policy integrity. We are celebrating our 15th year this year. So a bit of a pause for quick history lesson. In 2008, Ricky Revesz, who is currently the OIRA administrator, and Michael Livermore, who is currently at faculty at University of Virginia School of Law, founded Policy Integrity. Their goal was to carry out the mission they laid out in their book, Retaking Rationality. For those of you who are not familiar with the book, Retaking Rationality explained how rational economic analysis can be an advocate's most powerful tool. For a long period of time, cost-benefit analysis and generally economic analysis got a bad reputation. They were typically used in a biased fashion, often leading to deregulation or insufficient protections. But an even-handed and a well-done cost-benefit analysis often supports strong protections for the environment, consumers, and public health. And over the past 15 years, this kind of status quo thinking has changed due in part to the work of policy integrity and other advocates. Indeed, many federal agencies and courts today make clear that regulations must be evaluated with a balanced look at not just costs they impose, but also the benefits they bring to society, and a careful accounting of public health and environmental improvements. And policy integrity and our partners were hugely successful in our efforts to show that smart regulations are often cost-benefit justified, and good economic analysis could be used to design and implement sound, legally defensible regulations that work. Over the past 15 years, policy integrity has made a tangible impact, helping shape important policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Our briefs and research have been cited by the Supreme Court and other federal courts in several important cases. Our input has helped shape important policy decisions in New York, California, Colorado, Connecticut, and several other states. Our public comments have been cited and discussed in numerous federal policy proceedings, helping lead to better energy and environmental policy decisions. Last year was a particularly exciting year for policy integrity, and I'm going to give just 2 examples out of many. We have helped influence key updates to Circular A4. For those of you who are not cost-benefit analysis nerds like us at Policy Integrity, this little wonky document is the primary guidance document for federal agencies of regulatory analysis. And the proposed updates are the first in 20 years and will modernize agency practices to provide better accounting of benefits and costs occurring in the US, abroad, and in the future. These updated practices will lead to more rational and robust protections for the environment, the climate, and importantly, for future generations. And we have been pushing for many of these updates for several years, and our publications serve as a foundation for the update. Another quick example, our research and advocacy also served as a key input for the Environmental Protection Agency's social cost of greenhouse gas metrics. Again, it's a nerdy little number, but this value is important for any agency action related to climate change. The new value is almost 4 times higher than the previous value and will help bolster stronger climate policies. These values cite policy integrity's work more than 50 times, which is more than any other institution or author, and uses functions and arguments that we developed. Policy integrity also has a training mission, and we're very proud to see that our past fellows, staff members, and students have gone on to notable roles in government, academia, and private sector. So what makes policy integrity distinctive? I believe our strength comes from policy integrity's unique position at the intersection of law, economics, and policy. Our expertise allows us to do high-quality academic research and policy advocacy. Courts, agencies, and other decision makers often listen to our arguments because they are built on careful consideration of the academic literature, and they provide a balanced and unbiased analysis. And our successes are the results of incredible work by my policy integrity colleagues. We're lucky to have an amazingly talented group of lawyers and economists and strategy and operations professionals. They're all here today, and I encourage you to find them and talk to them about their work. As I said, we're very excited to celebrate this milestone with you. Before we start today, a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you who want to get CLE credits for the day, the written materials are available in the lobby, and you need to sign in and out for the sessions you attend. And if you're watching us online, the written materials are online, and the moderators for each panel is going to give code words during their panel. You have to submit those code words using the Google form on the conference website. All right, so without further ado, let's begin today's first panel. And to introduce our panelists and begin the discussion, I will hand things off to Jack Lienke, our Regulatory Policy Director.
Thank you, Burçin. And thank you to all of you for being here today, and to some people who registered and did not show up because we were worried about being over capacity in this room. So this is perfect. So thank you to those here and those not here. And all of you online. Good morning, I'm Jack Lienke, the Regulatory Policy Director here at Policy Integrity, and I'm thrilled to be here with this terrific group of panelists today. I'm going to briefly set the scene for this panel. So when we had this conference last year, we were coming off a summer with 2 major environmental policy developments. The first was that after a 7-year fight, the Supreme Court in West Virginia versus EPA deemed the EPA's 2015 Clean Power Plan unlawful, and for the first time in a majority opinion, invoked the major questions doctrine, which seemed like majorly bad news for climate policy and for the administrative state more generally. But the second development was that Congress shocked everyone by passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which contained a dizzying array of subsidies for clean energy technology. And so at our fall 2022 conference, the conventional take seemed to be The era of regulation has ended. The era of spending has begun. Goodbye, neoliberalism. Hello, industrial policy, etc. And here we are a year later, and the reality is more complicated because, surprise, the Clean Air Act still exists, and EPA still has a legal obligation to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases and other air pollutants from power plants and cars and all sorts of other sources. But the legally and economically appropriate design and stringency of those regulations is absolutely informed by the availability of IRA subsidies. And so that is what we're here to talk about today. What is the IRA accomplishing on its own? What can Clean Air Act regulations add to the mix? Is the court going to muck everything up again? And we've got the perfect group of panelists to discuss that. You can see their full, very intimidating bios in your conference packets. But just briefly, we have two air pollution regulators, one who deals with sources that move and one who deals with sources that don't. So Alejandra Nunez is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mobile Sources at EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, and Tomás Carbonell is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Stationary Sources at OAR. We have a seasoned environmental litigator. Kevin Poloncarz is a partner with Covington and Burling, where he co-chairs the firm's Energy and Environment Practice Group. And finally, we have an expert analyst of emissions trends and a former White House climate policymaker herself. Kate Larsen is a partner at Rhodium Group, where she leads the firm's international energy and climate research. So, I'll shut up. We'll start with each panelist giving 10-ish minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll have time for discussion and Q&A. For the Q&A, you can write your questions on a note card in the middle of your table and hand them to friendly people who will be roaming the room collecting such cards. And also, as Burçin said, at some point or points, I can't even say that it's just 1 point, those are the rules. At some point or points in this panel, I will say a magic word that you will need to write down if you are watching this online. If you're in the room, you can also write it down. You will get nothing in return. Okay, so I think we're going to start with Tomás.
Thank you, Jack. And can you all hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you for this discussion on this really timely and important topic. And thanks, Jack, for that setup. As Jack indicated, I work alongside Ale in the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, working on a range of stationary source programs, all directed at implementing the Clean Air Act and securing clean and healthy air and a safer climate for all Americans. I wanted to take just a few minutes here to talk about our work on the power sector. And I should start by emphasizing that in our work on the power sector, despite the title of this panel, we're actually not focused on the energy transition as such. We're not energy regulators at EPA. We are focused on regulating pollution, protecting human health and the environment, and that's the lens through which we approach this work. I also want to emphasize that when we look at the power sector, we really see it as a place where not just the administration's focus on the climate crisis and addressing climate pollution is a key consideration, but it's also a place where the administration's broader focus on protecting public health and advancing environmental justice converge. The power sector, of course, it's the largest stationary producer of greenhouse gases in the United States. It's responsible for about 25% of the nation's CO2 pollution. But in addition, power plants also emit a range of other health-harming pollutants, including toxic air pollutants like mercury and other toxic metals, pollutants like nitrogen oxides and SO2 that contribute to soot and smog pollution. And they have impacts that go beyond air as well on our land and water. And many of these impacts do fall on already overburdened and vulnerable communities. So in March of last year, recognizing that full suite of impacts, Administrator Regan articulated a comprehensive vision for EPA's work on the power sector. And we committed as an agency to deploying all of our tools and authorities to address this full suite of impacts. And we've been moving forward with a few actions as part of this initiative in parallel. And I'll say just a little bit about those in a minute. But through this, kind of comprehensive approach, what we're looking to do is, of course, fulfill our responsibilities to protect human health and the environment, but in addition, provide regulatory certainty and a long-term planning horizon by essentially laying out the full landscape of health and environmental obligations for the sector in a way that's close in time. And we think that will allow states and grid operators and power companies to really make informed, long-term investment and planning decisions and really preserve the ability of the industry to continue delivering reliable and affordable electricity. This is a service, obviously, on which we all rely. I also just want to note as kind of a broad theme here and pick up on something that Jack mentioned, which is that we're doing this work at an incredibly dynamic time for the power sector. Really over the last 15 years, we've seen the sector begin this really rapid transition to cleaner sources of energy. It's been driven by a range of factors, including huge shifts in the market, technology advancements, state policies, federal policies, and CO2 emissions from the sector in particular are about 40% lower than their peak levels in 2005. And then on top of that now, we have seen the historic investments and incentives that were reflected in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in the IRA. And with those $391 billion of clean energy incentives and investments, we are expecting even more change going forward. EPA, as it happens, just a couple of weeks ago, produced an analysis, kind of a meta-analysis of studies of the IRA that found that the IRA could cause power sector emissions of greenhouse gases to fall to 49 to 83% below 2005 levels by 2030. So as we've done this work, we recognize that change, and that's one reason why we've really emphasized engagement with a broad range of stakeholders, including all of the sort of regulatory entities, companies, grid operators that are shaping the sector to make sure that we can understand that changing landscape and how our rules fit in it. Just to say a little bit about some of the specific actions that we're moving forward with under this comprehensive power sector strategy. The first action, and the one that's sort of farthest along, is what we call the Good Neighbor Plan, which we issued in March as a final rule. This is a rule that is directed at reducing smog-forming pollution, nitrogen oxides, from power plants as well as other industrial sources. And this is pollution that crosses state lines and contributes to unhealthy levels of ground-level ozone or smog in many downwind communities. The rule went into effect this summer, and as crafted as a final rule, it applied to a total of 23 states. There's some litigation we can talk about on that score, but it really is intended to deliver significant health benefits in communities across the country and help ensure that we're meeting health-based air quality standards for ozone that were set back in 2015. That rule builds on a long history of successful EPA programs to address this type of interstate air pollution, like our cross-state air pollution rule. And like those prior rules, this rule leverages cost-effective technologies and strategies. And it has a key component that focuses on the power sector. Beginning with this ozone season, fossil fuel-fired power plants in a large number of these 23 states were required to participate in a strengthened and updated version of our ozone season allowance trading program for NOx. And the trading program includes some important design features that draw on the lessons of our past trading programs and were intended to ensure or incentivize power plants to operate their controls consistently throughout the ozone season. We projected that the Good Neighbor Plan would save 1,300 lives by 2026 once it's fully implemented, and reduce hospital visits for thousands of people with respiratory issues. So that was the first piece. A second major piece of the power sector vision relates to air toxics. These are hazardous air pollutants like mercury and other toxic metals. In February, we issued a final rule determining that it's appropriate and necessary under the Clean Air Act to regulate these pollutants from power plants. For those of you who are cognoscenti of the Clean Air Act, you may know this has been an issue where there have been a number of rulemakings over the years. But this rulemaking was really essential to restore the legal underpinning for our mercury and air toxic standards for coal-fired power plants. And this is a unique circumstance where we had a rule that was actually not challenged. So that has gone into effect. Also, in this regard, last April, we issued a proposed rule to strengthen and update our mercury and air toxic standards. And this is really the most significant update that we've proposed to those standards since they were first issued in February of 2012. It's part of our duty to kind of review these standards over time to make sure they keep up with developments in control technologies. And as part of that package, we propose to strengthen standards for particulate matter, which are a surrogate for non-mercury metals, as well as to strengthen our standards for mercury from lignite power plants and update and strengthen monitoring requirements for particulate matter. So again, these revisions really kind of build on what have been highly successful and cost-effective protections in the mercury and air toxic standards. The public comment period closed on that this spring. We're in the process of reviewing comments, but we're really working towards issuing a final rule in the spring of next year. Lastly, I want to touch on a piece of our work that's really focused on greenhouse gases, and Jack alluded to this and provided some nice litigation backgrounds, and that is what we call our carbon pollution standards for fossil fuel-fired power plants. We issued those on May 11th. This rulemaking really consists of kind of three central pillars. First is a set of proposed provisions that revise and strengthen and update CO2 standards that are already on the books for new natural gas-fired combustion turbines. In addition, we have proposed what we call emission guidelines that states should follow under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act to set standards for existing steam electric generating units, and this is primarily kind of existing coal-fired power plants. And then we've proposed a set of emission guidelines that apply to large and heavily utilized existing gas combustion turbines. And again, these are guidelines that states would follow under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act to set standards for those existing facilities. We're expecting significant benefit or projecting significant benefits from that package of proposed provisions. We issued some updated modeling over the summer that indicated that this package would avoid 775 million metric tons of CO2 through 2042, on top of what we're already anticipating through the IRA. In addition, the proposal would cut tens of thousands of tons of harmful air pollutants, including direct emissions of particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide. And in 2030 alone, we project the proposal would avoid 1,300 premature deaths and more than 300,000 asthma attacks. Building on Jack's point about the Supreme Court's decision in West Virginia last summer, we worked really carefully as we were developing this proposal to make sure that we remained within the boundaries of that decision and the Supreme Court's ruling on the scope of our authority under Section 111. And when you look at the standards, whether it's for the new sources or the existing sources covered by this proposal, we've basically established very traditional kind of performance standards for CO2 from these different units that leverage technologies that we've deemed to be cost-effective and available, and that can be applied directly to those plants to reduce their CO2 emissions. There's a suite of standards in this rule, and to set the proposed level of those standards, we looked at a range of approaches, but that includes technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, natural gas co-firing in the case of coal plants, use of low greenhouse gas hydrogen in the case of natural gas plants, as well as just efficient operating practices for those units. One thing that we were conscious of as we were developing the proposal as well was the need to provide the power sector with the kind of lead time and flexibility that we've typically afforded in our power sector rules to ensure that the power sector can continue to deliver reliable and affordable electricity. We've done that by setting compliance deadlines that are fairly forward-looking. And we've also proposed a structure where we are essentially recognizing that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all technology or approach for reducing CO2 from these plants. Instead, we recognize that the opportunities for these plants really vary, in part based on how long existing plants intend to operate into the future, or how intensively they're operated. And so we've taken that into account and proposed to set kind of differentiated standards, different subcategories of standards that are based on those factors and that reflect the different opportunities that are available to those different types of plants. And that essentially provides a lot of optionality for the power sector when it comes to decisions about how to invest in and operate new and existing facilities while still meeting the environmental goals of the program. We have taken into account the IRA as part of the development of that proposal. We looked at incentives for technologies like hydrogen and CCS as we were evaluating the cost effectiveness of technologies for these plants. And I think, broadly, we've also incorporated the IRA and the impacts that we'll have into our modeling of the proposed rule. The comment period closed on August 8th. We got over 1.2 million comments. We're quite busy these days reviewing those, and we're also looking to issue a final rule in this proceeding by spring of next year. So those are sort of the key air-related actions that I wanted to talk about in terms of our power sector work. I will just quickly note that in addition to that regulatory work, EPA is also busy kind of implementing certain provisions of the IRA that are relevant here, including programs like climate pollution reduction grants, a $5 billion program to support states, tribal nations in undertaking planning to reduce climate pollution, and there's the opportunity at least to use that kind of funding to support activities that reduce power sector pollution and enhance the efficiency of buildings and end uses, as well as other programs. And I felt like it was important to note that piece of our work that's a really key complement to the regulatory side. I think I've said enough for an intro, so with that, I just want to thank you again and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Ale?
Thank you, Jack. Can everybody hear me? Yes, okay. So, as Jack mentioned, I am the Deputy Assistant Administrator for everything that moves. So I support the team that develops emission standards for new vehicles and engines, and also our partnership programs that relate to transportation. So I'm so thankful and delighted to be here to be able to share the progress we're making and what's left to be done, right? There's a lot of work that's happening. So let me talk about the major rulemakings that we completed during the first half of the administration and how those set the stage for what we're doing now. So President Biden, on day one, issued an executive order that required many federal agencies, including EPA, to assess some actions that were issued during the previous administration and determine whether they needed to be revised. So as part of that process, EPA considered and decided to take another look at the emission standards for greenhouse gases for light-duty vehicles. And in doing so, we set standards for model years 2023 through 2026. We finalized that rule in December of 2021, and we also reconsidered the decision to withdraw California's waiver for the light-duty vehicle program. So we basically reconsidered that action. Both of those actions are currently in litigation. We also did the second part. The previous administration had done an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to look at the question of whether to regulate NOx emissions from heavy-duty engines. And in this administration, we actually crafted the program. That standard hadn't been updated since year 2001. And heavy-duty truck pollution, as we all know, while light-duty vehicle represents the largest share of greenhouse gas pollution from vehicles, heavy-duty trucks really affect disproportionately communities that are overburdened by air pollution. There are 70 million people who live next to major highways, in ports, next to rail yards, and so on, who are, for the most part, communities of color and low-income families. So we finalized that program, and then in April, we issued proposals. First, a multi-pollutant proposal for light-duty and medium-duty, Class 2B and 3 vehicles, for so both criteria pollution and also greenhouse gases for model year 2026 and beyond, which I'm sure you see a lot of commentary happening everywhere. And then our proposed update to the Phase 2 standards and also setting new standards for heavy-duty trucks. These are only for greenhouse gases. We had done a criteria pollution standard just a few months before. And those are also covering, we are proposing to cover model years 2027 and beyond. Just like Tomás said, as our job as air pollution regulators, the air quality benefits that we're projecting from these proposals in terms of reductions of greenhouse gases, these two proposals together would avoid 9 billion tons of CO2 which is massive, but also result in very, very substantial improvements in public health, reduction of criteria pollution that causes respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, and a lot of benefits also for those communities that are most overburdened by air pollution, which, as you all know, is one of the key priorities of President Biden. What's the approach we're taking to all of these standards? Okay, these are very stringent, but also achievable standards. We have a technical record that supports the approach to setting performance standards, which EPA has been doing for many, many years, many times already. And for our light-duty vehicle standard, which is discussed a lot, we are projecting that by year 2032, which is the end of our proposal, 67% of new vehicle sales, light-duty vehicle sales, would be battery electric, and 46% would be for medium duty, would be electric in 2032. Our analysis is looking at where the manufacturers are going. Many of them, both in the light-duty industry and the heavy-duty sector, they are moving towards zero-emission technologies. They have set very, very ambitious goals to get there, to get involved in this transition. They are moving toward hybrid vehicles and battery electric vehicles, but also consumer preferences are changing. Battery costs are decreasing very significantly. So our record for all these rules, although it's different, is actually looking at those sorts of questions, charging infrastructure that would support the proposed levels of ambition. And just like in the context of the power sector and all of our rules, we have issued proposals, but we're also taking comment on less stringent alternatives and more stringent alternatives. Our comment periods ended by early June. We were done. We had hundreds of people testifying in public hearings, lots of interest in these two rulemakings. Thank you all to those of you that have actually submitted comments to the record, both technical and legal, that are helping set the foundation for the development of the options that our team will bring to Administrator Regan for decision. And that's where we are right now. And let me just say some of the benefits, aside from the general public health benefits that are very significant, and the consumer savings, and the decreases in maintenance costs, for example, in the heavy-duty industry, that in the light-duty vehicle standard, under our proposal, we are projecting up to 1.6 trillion in net monetary benefits, and for heavy-duty, up to 320 billion. So those would be very programs that, if finalized, would achieve very significant reductions. And that's it for the regulatory work, but as Tomás mentioned, and I should have mentioned that obviously the IRA very much influenced the analysis of our baselines that we're using to develop these proposals, right? But not only it's so exciting to be working in these rulemakings in EPA, but also we have very significant funding programs for the transportation sector that can help also address this transition to zero-emission vehicle technologies. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA received $5 billion over 5 years to replace diesel school buses with electric buses and cleaner school buses with other fuel, CNG, propane, and also electric. So we have already completed a first round of rebate funding where we had announced $400 million, and there was so much interest in the program that we ended up allocating almost $1 billion for the first round, and then we designed a grant program, a competitive grant program. That application period just closed in late August, so we're looking at those applications, and there we made available for $100 million. We'll see how the applications look like, but now we're moving on to design the next rebate round. So those who are interested and helping school districts working on this, well, thank you, and you'll be hearing from us soon. And then let me also say for transportation, under the Inflation Reduction Act, EPA will be able to allocate $1 billion for zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles, heavy-duty class 6 and 7 trucks. So we're currently looking at, we're focused on school buses, but we're starting to think about how that program is going to look like. So it's $1 billion, out of which $400 million can be allocated to non-attainment areas. And then for ports, EPA, who for many years had a program that's called the Ports Initiative that provides technical assistance to port authorities in order to help them develop emissions inventories and help them engage with the communities that live next to the ports. So we received $3 million under this Ports Grant Program, and we're currently in the design phase for that funding. $750 million actually need to be, by statute, allocated to non-attainment areas. So that's a good opportunity for states that are looking into attainment goal strategies. And I'll just mention in passing the CPRG, Climate Pollution Reduction Grants, and the GGRF, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that might also, if there is interest, address transportation emissions reduction. So I'll stop there.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to discussing.
Kevin, do we get to keep any of these nice things? You don't actually have to answer that question, sorry.
Well, thank you all for inviting me. This is my first time ever at NYU Law, but it feels, I mean, Burçin, you said about how policy integrity provides comments, and sometimes the courts read them and we provide briefs. Also, sometimes the litigants read them. And I, along with attorney from the New York AG's office, argued the main statutory point and what was the precursor to West Virginia versus EPA. And it was no secret that my primary study aid for that argument was policy integrity's brief. And so it's not just the courts that might listen to the work that is done by an institute like this, but you play a really important role. And so, okay, I wanted to touch a little bit on what Jack is getting at. That was my biggest win in my career in that case. We won an American Lung Association, and then I experienced the biggest loss of my career in West Virginia. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what is the role of regulation. And then we had this marvelous gift that got passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's really important for us to just reflect for a second on how that bill got passed and the odd procedural maneuvers that were necessary to get it passed, because it informs why the bill takes the form it does. We all know, well, we should all know about the cloture rule and the filibuster and the need to get a supermajority vote in the Senate in order to pass comprehensive legislation. Well, the administration went in a different direction with using the budget reconciliation process, and which is subject to this arcane rule known as the Byrd Rule, which purportedly says you can't enact things that don't have a budgetary impact. And so the president's big climate bill is a spending bill. And so in the absence of the ability to endorse a regulatory approach for climate in an explicit fashion, what we have are a lot of carrots. No direct sticks, but a lot of carrots. But what I want to talk about a little bit is the really interesting nuggets in this bill that really show how both legislation and regulation inform one another, and how, when EPA is now designing its regulatory approach, it can lean on the availability of these incentives in this massive piece, this once-in-a-generational piece of legislation, to decide what is achievable. I first want to talk about one thing that Tomás alluded to, this report that EPA released last week. Really important report, might have slipped under the radar screen. Most of you didn't see it. It was issued by EPA pursuant to Section 135 of the Clean Air Act. Wait, did you hear that? EPA enacted new sections of the Clean Air Act? Well, not EPA, Congress did. And in Section 135, it gives all these little pots of money for different purposes, all related to assessing greenhouse gas reductions and what can be achieved in terms of greenhouse gas reductions from changes in domestic electricity generation and use. And then in the penultimate subparagraph, it says, we give a little bit of money to EPA, it's like $1 million, I think, to assess the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions projected to occur from changes in domestic electricity generation and use through 2031. And then in the final paragraph, it says it gives a little bit of money to EPA to ensure that reductions in such emissions occur, including through use of the existing authorities under this act. Now, that's really important. That's Congress. This is an act of Congress that was subject to presentment. This is a true act of Congress, and it says, hey, EPA, you've got this authority, and we want you to use it to achieve reductions. And the two principal staff folks, Greg Dotson and Dustin Maghimfar, wrote an article in which they say what this means in saying EPA do this assessment and then use your existing authorities is that the IRA and everything that it achieves is the baseline. And Congress wants EPA to go further than that. Regulation isn't something that's just meant to follow what is happening as a result of tax incentives and expenditures. Regulation is something that's meant to secure reductions. So that's a really, that's like the gem. That is my view. I worked on it a little bit, so I'm proud. But that is the gem of the IRA in terms of how it shows how legislation and regulation can complement one another. And I just want to provide one other example, because I'm really looking forward to questions. There are a lot of really brilliant people out here. The methane fee, that's a BFD, as President Biden would say. That is an explicit carbon price on emissions from the oil and gas industry. But what does it say? It says this fee applies, but only if all states are not implementing plans pursuant to Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, which is EPA's existing authority to regulate oil and gas emissions as they're doing, and that requires a process where states issue plans for existing sources to comply with those standards. So what does that say? Wow, what position does that put West Virginia and Texas in? Their sources are gonna be subject to a fee for every ton of emissions unless they actually issue a plan that EPA can approve for regulating those sources. That's really interesting, isn't it? So that is a way in which this bill really, I mean, I had my head in my hands for most of the summer thinking, oh my God, we're done, us regulatory lawyers, we're never gonna litigate anything again. I need to pivot at this stage in my career, and I have to some extent. I've now jokingly described myself as a tax lawyer because I filed comments at the IRS on really critical pieces of things like 45V, 45Q, that's the qualified clean hydrogen credits, that's the CCS credits. And those credits are the things that EPA is relying upon in demonstrating that reductions from the power sector of the sort it's projecting are achievable. And so regulatory lawyers like me do have an afterlife. In fact, another plug to NYU, you guys stole one of my key associates to be the first clean energy and climate specialist at the Tax Policy Institute, which is an amazing thing. And that's a great place to see, like, there's the intersectionality. We're all going to be tax lawyers going forward. So I'll just close with that and say I think it was a premature conclusion that regulation is dead. And I think that there's a really robust role for all of us regulatory lawyers in this new tax incentive-driven future.
Thank you, Kevin. Kate?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm kind of a different animal than everyone else up here. I work at the Rhodium group. We are a independent research firm that does the analysis to provide the information for these decision makers about how does policy, legislation, regulation, how do those all come together to achieve the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. And to remind you, that's getting to global net zero by 2050. For the US, it's hitting 50 to 52% reduction from 2005 greenhouse gas emissions levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. This is a big lift. And I think we talk a lot about the IRA here now because it was a historic piece of legislation, but really it's how that layers on top of the decades of regulatory policy at the federal and state level that have helped build the ecosystem that the IRA is operating in. The Rhodium Group contributes to all of the analysis that goes into this decision-making, including the updated social cost of carbon. Rhodium Group is part of a collaborative of climate scientists that helped understand, using an economist, understanding the economic impacts of climate change and filtering that back into the updated social cost of carbon. That data analysis is really critical for those assessments, but then also we do a lot of energy system modeling to understand what is the impact of these layered policies and tax incentives. Does it get us to where we need to be? What's happening in the real world? And how do we filter that information back to policymakers? Because this is just the beginning. We've made huge strides, but this is really just the beginning of what we need to do. I'll make sure I'm on the right slide here. I really want to focus on the IRA, but thinking about it again as how it layers over all of the other policies that have been put in place. And we modeled, each year Rhodium Group models all of the policies, legislation, market conditions to understand what path that puts us on. We do this under an analysis including uncertainty and a lot of variables that contribute. So we have a range of different potential outcomes, but this year, including the IRA and all of the other policies that have been adopted to date, the U.S. is on a path to emission reductions of 29 to 42% by 2030. Not where we need to be, but getting closer. As you can see, that represents a pretty steep decline in emissions over time. But those emission reductions start to peter out. That momentum peters out after 2030. And again, the IRA and many of the regulations that have been put in place are targeting the sectors that are easiest to decarbonize, where we've made the most progress, electric power and vehicles. Thanks to the efforts of EPA and others. We look at the 2030 timeline also because that's where we have our 50 to 52% emission reduction goal. But what we need to do now is also start investing in the technologies that we will need to continue that momentum beyond 2030. When we look at what additional policies the administration, states, and others could put in place under our joint action scenario, and you'll see this includes some of the proposals that have been discussed today in addition to states ramping up their efforts, utilities and others going above and beyond the commitments they've made to date. You can see that we may be or could get on track toward hitting our 2030 goal. But again, even those additional policies that have not yet been enacted start to lose momentum in the post-2030 timeframe. So again, we need to continue, we need to make those investments in the policies that help reduce emissions today to decarbonize our power grid, but then also start beginning to look into the future. We are also tracking what this is doing in real time. So this is what we are projecting will happen in terms of new clean energy deployment under our projected emissions scenarios going out to 2035. A lot of new clean energy is going to be deployed under these combination of incentives and regs. A lot of that is going towards solar and wind, renewable technologies, but also batteries are ramping up over time. That pushes out a lot of coal and a little bit of gas in the next 5 to 10 years. That's where we see those emission reductions, is when you push out the incumbent fossil. But again, as you can see, towards the later years, while we are adding lots of new clean generation, we are not pushing anything else off the grid towards the latter years in 2030 and beyond. So that's what we model will happen. Our team of energy systems modelers help guide policy by saying this is what we think, how we think the economy will respond. What we are also doing is tracking what has actually happened since the adoption of the IRA, and I think this is important to take into account. Rhodium Group, in partnership with MIT, Brian Deese from the White House, who you may have heard of, is now at MIT, built a new climate investment monitor, which is actually tracking in real time investments in clean energy technologies, both announced and actual. And this is helping us understand the impacts so that regulators, other decision makers can incorporate what's a better understanding of what we expect to happen in the future in order to set the policies that go beyond. And what we're seeing is a huge ramp up in investment, in particular in manufacturing. That's increased. Clean energy manufacturing has increased 37% in the last year. Those investments, that's a huge ramp up. A lot of that is in electric vehicles and battery technologies. But we're also seeing a ramp up in energy and industry investments, and in the retail sector as well, if you think about vehicles, home investments in vehicles, all of this driven by the IRA and the underlying policies. And so all of this data is available online. It's something that is really helpful to understand the evolution over time of how the real world responds to policy and incentives. If you look at the ramp up over time, a lot of that investment is going toward batteries, and zero-emission vehicles. That's where the response is fastest. And it's happening across the US in states that may or may not have the policies that are driving these investments, but it's creating the constituencies for clean energy and technology manufacturing across the US. Oh, am I not?
I'm advancing it along with you.
Thank you. That's probably easier. And this is happening, as I said, across lots of different states that you may not have thought: Tennessee, Michigan, Georgia. Next slide. It's happening as a high share of their GDP. This is increasingly becoming an industry that will have a lot to say about future policy as they become constituents. And just to wrap up, all of this information helps us understand the dynamic that policymakers are looking at for the coming years. Where are these investments happening? And then just finally, on the retail space, real acceleration in the uptake of zero-emission vehicles, a little bit slower on distributed electricity and storage and heat pumps. But this is really important information to feed back into the system of policymaking. And I want to talk quickly about how we think about that slowing down of emission reductions that we see in the post-2030 period, and how we get ahead of that, how we build the conditions for reducing the cost of the technologies we need in order to allow for the regulatory process and the legislative process to see that these technologies will be cost effective, in order for new policies to require these technologies be put in place. And one way to think about that is the massive uptake in solar technologies is largely because the costs of those technologies have come down over time. The economics really matter in how quickly these technologies deploy. If we think about those examples with solar PV, how do we make that same drastic cost reduction happen for the technologies that we need for the future? These technologies are going to be needed for decarbonizing freight, for shipping, for aviation, all of industry. These are sectors of the economy that are not directly regulated yet in the US, except for some heavy-duty sectors for vehicles. We need to develop the technologies so that they are available for the rulemaking process to be able to require them. And so one way to think about that is, if you thought about solar PV in the late 1980s, if we had known how critical cost reductions in this technology would be to decarbonizing the electric power sector, if we had invested in an additional $5 billion earlier on in let's say the late 1980s, we could have dropped the price for solar PV by about 50% within 5 years. That would have really kick-started that industry much earlier. This is the reason that we have all the spending in areas where we are trying to innovate in new technologies in order to bring these costs down. If you think about those cost reductions, then applying throughout the economy, and this is not just the US, the cost for solar PV came down globally, helped scale these technologies in other countries. By bringing down those costs, we are shifting the curve forward in terms of deployment. That's what is getting these technologies pushed out into the world. So Rhodium Group and Breakthrough Energy have been using this dynamic and thinking about how can we create the incentives, the understanding of how important these new emerging technologies will be, how important it is to bring down their costs so that they can be cost-effective solutions for future policymaking, developed the emerging technology or climate technology framework, which allows us to understand how effective investments today, like the IRA and other investments being made, how can they help bring the cost for these emerging technologies like clean hydrogen, sustainable fuels like sustainable aviation fuels, CCS and direct air capture that might be useful for decarbonizing industry. How can we invest in those today through investments that are called for in the IRA? How can that help accelerate the transition? So we used the Emerging Climate Technology Framework to understand how the IRA helps deploy these technologies, not just in the US, but globally. So by bringing the cost down for clean hydrogen, direct air capture, and sustainable aviation fuels through the IRA incentives, we estimated that not only does it help reduce emissions in the US, it helps scale these industries and technologies to a point where it helps diffuse those technologies globally. This isn't the original intent of the IRA, but it is a spillover effect, and it's one that Europe is thinking about and others. How do we help the rest of the world decarbonize? It's not part of US policymaking in terms of our regulatory policy, but it does have that impact, and ultimately that's what we are trying to do. And so having the analytical capabilities to understand how these investments matter in order to make the case domestically for continued investment is really critical to generating this cycle of positive reinforcement in terms of policy, markets, and economics, and the legislation and regulation that pair together to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if you have questions, there are friendly people waving. They want your note cards. While I wait for those note cards, I have a couple questions. So the first, I think, really, Ale, Kate, or Tomás could answer, or could answer together. Kevin mentioned that Congress intended for the IRA to be the baseline for EPA regulation, which sounds great, but it's really difficult to figure out what that baseline is, right? Because the IRA is not a regulation that says reduce emissions from sources in this sector by X%. It's money, and how that money affects emissions depends on choices by other regulators like IRS, like DOE, like FERC. It depends on permitting decisions. It depends on private sector decisions. So how does EPA grapple with that uncertainty about kind of the baseline emissions levels? It's been accused by some of being overly rosy in its projections of what the IRA will do on its own. But I'm also thinking about the ironic fact that by the time the Supreme Court got around to declaring the Clean Power Plan unlawful, the power sector had already, on a nationwide basis, achieved the rules required emissions reductions, even without the rule ever taking effect. So there's also the risk, right, of being too pessimistic about what the IRA can do on its own and issuing a rule, either the power sector or the transportation sector that doesn't end up being binding. So how do you deal with that problem?
So I can take a stab at an answer, Jack, from the stationary source side, and then Ale, you can correct and add and provide additional perspective from the mobile source side. So one thing I'll notice, I'll probably get in trouble with our general counsel if I offer the kind of interpretations that in the level of detail that Kevin provided on Section 135. But I think it is fair to say that that section does kind of reflect the expectation that we will be using our authorities to reduce greenhouse gases. And it's a helpful statement from Congress, in that way. What I also want to say, though, is that when we are carrying out these rulemakings, we are working within our core traditional, Clean Air Act authorities, whether it's Title II for the mobile source programs, whether it's Section 111 for our carbon pollution standards. We are working within those provisions, as we've traditionally understood them, as the courts have interpreted them, and we look at, the kinds of usually kind of source or sector-specific factors around cost and emission reduction that tend to drive regulatory decisions in those spaces. So for the purposes of for example the carbon pollution standards proposal, The kind of analysis that we did in this LEAP report that was issued last week, that wasn't actually like a driver for the decisions that are reflected in the proposal, right? Our decisions in the proposal were based on our assessment of technologies, our assessment of emission reduction potential for those technologies, costs, availability, those kind of very traditional factors that are kind of really abstracted from a look at economy-wide reductions from the IRA and how the rules might intersect with that. So I'm sorry for all the throat clearing, but I feel like these are important context for you all to hear about how we make these decisions. With respect to the questions about the modeling, it's true, modeling these baselines is tough. And that's not a new challenge because of the IRA, right? I mean, when we always do, for our power sector rules, modeling in our integrated planning model, to try to assess what the impacts of those rules look like, going out, a decade or more. And that involves judgments about the future, about, how investments will be made, about how infrastructure will be developed. And, we go through our notice and comment process, and sometimes we go through external kind of engagement with experts as well to try to make sure that we're making the best possible judgments, and where there are judgments being made that could really have an impact on the outcomes, that we take into account some uncertainties, sensitivities, so that we can probe different ways of looking at the future. I think my understanding is that when we look at our own IPM modeling for how the power sector will respond to the IRA, our outcomes have kind of been in the middle when you look at the range of projections that are out there, neither sort of falling in the most optimistic camp nor necessarily falling in the most pessimistic camp. And I think that reflects just sort of a degree of conservatism that we usually kind of build into our assessments, as well as our efforts to really kind of be in touch with the expert modeling community as we do that work, and try to develop assumptions and judgments that are sort of supportable in that sense.
Thanks.
Ale, I don't know if you want to add.
Thank you, Tomás. So I'll reiterate. The way we develop the regulatory programs is by following the statutory factors. So Section 202A of the Clean Air Act requires us to look at the likelihood of the development of technology, lead time, other factors. So as part of looking at the technology options, we obviously are looking at the application of the tax incentives. So this is application of the statutory factors. But I will also say, to give you an example, in the light-duty vehicle standard, we review the statute. We see there are some conditions, right, that Congress wanted to incentivize the creation of domestic manufacturing capacity. So we're looking at those things, and we also make what we think are conservative assumptions about how consumers are going to take advantage of the tax credit. Remember that in the vehicles field, we look at the cost of compliance for manufacturers, but of course, as part of the consumer analysis, we're looking at those assumptions about the tax credits. Third thing is coordination. We obviously coordinate with our partners at the Treasury Department. When we were in the interagency review process for the light-duty vehicle proposal, Treasury put out guidance, and that actually allowed us to look more closely to this and ground truth the assumptions we were making. Likewise, right now there's coordination because Treasury is going to put out guidance. So all those things internally, there's a lot of coordination that's happening in our case, not only with NHTSA, but with other agencies, DOE, Treasury as well. And fourth and final, the record. The record, we ask a lot of questions, and we ask commenters to please chime in on the assumptions we were making on all things tax incentives. And so that record is something that we're looking at very, very carefully. So the combination of those factors is how we're going to develop the assumptions for the final program.
Thank you. Kevin, I wondered if you wanted to give us a take on last week's oral argument in the DC Circuit regarding EPA's model year 2022 through 2026, 2023 through 2026 standards. The major questions doctrine has been raised in this case. Is the MQD coming for cars too? It already ate power plants.
Just to level set that lovely image for everyone, This case challenging EPA's model year 2023 to 2026 greenhouse gas reduction standards for light-duty vehicles was argued by counsel for oil companies, Republican states, and some biofuels producers. I think Texas's opening brief, the first paragraph says, this case is a rerun of West Virginia. And by that they mean, in West Virginia, on their take, the Supreme Court said you can't use Section 111 of the Clean Air Act to cause a transition from fossil generation to anything other than fossil generation. And under Section 202, you can't use the Clean Air Act to cause a shift from anything other than internal combustion engine motor vehicles to internal combustion engine motor vehicles. So it's a very cynical and, in my view, incorrect take on what the major questions doctrine is and what the scope of EPA's authority is under the Clean Air Act. And specifically, I think, under Section 202, it is a completely different beast than Section 111. It provides EPA the authority to look at motor vehicles, whether driven by an internal combustion engine, whether driven by an electric engine, and to look at the systems that could reduce or prevent that pollution. Prevent is different than reduce, right? Maybe that's an internal combustion engine. And so the statute in our case here speaks very directly to the scope of EPA's authority. But moreover, in this case, the argument was EPA is doing something radically transformative. They are using the Clean Air Act to not just cause tailpipe emissions to clean up, but to cause this radical shift in how people drive. And that is going to cause a radical shift in how we generate electricity because we're going to need a lot more. And that's going to cause a shift in needing things like critical minerals, which is going to imperil national security. That's the rhetoric. But it's a lot of rhetoric because under Section 202, EPA has long been using these provisions to allow things like averaging and trading, which those were the bogey here. Ooh, you're allowing electric vehicles to be averaged in and reduce the emissions on a fleet-wide basis, which is how EPA has always done emissions control for so many decades. And so there's no radical transformation of authority here. And despite the hyperbole, my view is that the court on Thursday was testing out, and this was really interesting because this was one of the first attempts to see how the DC Circuit, which is the court that really will grapple with this new doctrine, this long existing, only now recently named doctrine, in how it affects rulemaking. And you could see the most interesting point, and I might have said something about this earlier in the policy committee meeting, was Judge Katsas said, this is really EPA just turning the dial from 4 to 8. Well, turning the dial from 4 to 8, if they have a continuous obligation to see what emissions reductions are available, that's acting within their lane. They're not doing anything radically transformative. And when you get a statement like that from a Trump-appointed judge, you think you're doing pretty good vis-a-vis the MQD. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, wow, a lot of questions, all amazing, and I'm sorry in advance that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But some recurring ones. One, Kate, is how do you model for a potential change of administration in 2025? Right, and other questions, like to what extent can some of the IRA policies be undone, and how do we account for that in projecting emissions?
Well, we are not modeling that yet. And I think our experience during the previous administration was, peeling back the policies that were rolled back. But as you mentioned, the clean power, the clean power regs at the time that were rolled back, the emission reductions proposed through that program were achieved through the economy due to state-level RPS policies, due to cost declines in solar and other renewable technologies. So
a decade in advance.
A decade in advance, thank you. So I think there is, while policy drives so much, there is inertia in the system. The IRA incentives have a 10-year window for most of them, which is more than the other tax incentives, the cycle of adopting the ITC and PTC before, which was 1 year at a time, maybe 2 years. That certainty in terms of those tax credits for industry really kept the market in check. What we have now is that certainty for the next 10 years, and I'll let the legal experts talk about what in the IRA might survive an administration who is not amenable to, well, I don't even know how to say that, who's not excited about implementing the IRA, I'll put it that way. So there is a lot of inertia in the system due to, again, really driving down the costs of clean technologies in relation to fossil. And a lot of the existing regs, MATs and others, also help keep that relative cost for coal-fired generation higher than renewables. So this is the dynamic that we have set up through lots of other state policy, other drivers that are now part of the system that I think will be, cannot be wiped away with a new administration. We're not modeling any of this now, but I think it's really important, again, to consider what are the things that are the stickiest. So we know we will be weathering new administrations, and how do we build into the system this certainty? And again, this is part of creating the constituencies in places that don't typically have the constituencies for a clean energy industry. You saw those states that I mentioned that are getting a lot of new manufacturing investment for electric vehicles. They may, we'll see, to be determined how they respond to new policies that help these national industries in their states. So I think the reason that we have layered so many different kinds of policies on top of each other at the state, federal level, and a lot of the corporate commitments that hopefully will remain in place is to continue to drive the progress that we have made forward through any administration. And we saw that happening during the previous administration, that momentum was still there.
Thank you. So this is a question for Tomás. The Edison Electric Institute and utilities have pushed back on the power sector GHG proposal, saying that hydrogen and CCS are not ready for implementation. And what is EPA's response?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think you're highlighting that we got a lot of input from a lot of different stakeholders during the comment process. Did get a lot of comments from the major trade associations like Edison Electric Institute, a lot of individual power companies, grid operators. I think what I'll say is, first of all, I can't respond to those individual comments. We're in the middle of a rulemaking. We are giving them careful consideration. We're going to be engaging with the whole range of stakeholders, who participated in the comment process as we head towards a final rule. So I don't want to prejudge any of those judgments. But I think what I will say is, the intent of the proposal was to lay out our best understanding of the opportunities that are available to reduce CO2 emissions from new and existing plants. We look carefully at CCS and hydrogen as the basis for standards for certain of those plants. It wasn't sort of the basis of the standards across the board. We put forward what we thought was the best information that we had about the availability of those technologies, how they could be ramped up over time, their effectiveness. And we got we got some comments supporting our conclusions. We also got comments challenging our proposed conclusions. And the whole purpose of the rulemaking process is to sort of be able to sift through that input and arrive at final decisions that are supportable and that reflect the best information that we have. So we'll be doing that with those comments as with all the comments that we received.
Jack, might I respond?
Of course.
So EEI's comments have a very cynical view of what the Clean Air Act is intended to do. They reflect a view that is very at odds with how the DC Circuit has interpreted Section 111 for over a half century. They've always interpreted the Clean Air Act to be a technology forcing tool, and they've always allowed, when EPA is determining what is achievable, EPA to look forward, to project about the development of technology. Did my sound go out?
It did.
Was that intentional?
I did it. I didn't like your answer.
I'll borrow the administration's mic. And EPA has always been allowed to do this. They've always been allowed to reasonably project forward about how the technology is going to evolve over the term when the regulations will apply in the future, how costs are going to change. They can't, what the DC Circuit has said is they can't engage in crystal ball gazing, but to the extent they are making reasoned, informed judgments about the evolution of technology, that's okay, and that's what EPA has done here. They've looked at these things that are available to fossil generation, hydrogen, and CCS, and they said, these things are maturing at a rate that we believe that they will and are the best system of emission reduction. And what I will say, I'll be quick about this, is I was an English major, and so EEI's comments are premised upon one fundamental flaw. They say that the statute requires that something be achieved in practice today, needs to be on the street, rolled out. That's not what the statute says. They say it speaks in the past tense. Guess what it doesn't? It says that the administration is allowed to define standards that are based on the best system of emission reduction that has been adequately demonstrated. That's actually not the past tense. If you remember your grammar teacher, that's actually a past perfect tense. And it's not that it's been achieved, it's that it's achievable. So, you know, look at the statute and look at what the statute requires and look at what 50 years of DC Circuit jurisprudence have required. And I'm confident that what EPA has done here is very clearly in their lane as pollution regulator. They're looking at scrubbers. They've always looked at scrubbers. They're looking at cleaner fuels. They've always looked at cleaner fuels. And so I think when I looked at EEA's comments, there were a lot of hyperbole and a lot of really spacious legal argument tucked behind 70 pages about how their members are the leaders in the clean energy transition.
So the better joke would have been that Edison Electric cut your mic, and I really regret not making it in the moment. Okay, we still have time. Ali, maybe you would like to take this question.
I don't know.
Regarding the new EPA standards, standards are only as good as their enforcement. How robust is the monitoring and enforcement of these new standards? What steps is EPA taking to be proactive in monitoring and enforcement?
So I will say, well, we are the office that is developing the standards, right? And we have an Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance that is like going after companies that are doing wrong things. So that's not our purview, but I should say, and this is happening across all our work in the Office of Air and Radiation, that in addition to looking at how we're designing the standards following the statutory factors, we have also experts in our team that are looking very, very carefully at the compliance program to ensure that actually those standards that we're setting up work in the real world. I can give you a lot of examples about technologies that heavy-duty trucks have to install under our NOx program that are actually intended to make those standards better in the real world. Requirements for maintenance and insurance. These are all things that we really are paying attention to, that I'm glad that we actually get asked this question because it's very much part of the bread and butter of how the Office of Air is approaching the development of standards to make sure that they actually work. So thank you.
Tomás, it looks like you want to chime in.
Just to, like, endorse that is the approach kind of across the mobile source and stationary source
Correct.
rules. And I think I mentioned an example of where, you know, in the context of setting standards for power plants, we've looked at monitoring provisions as well. That's in the proposed rule to update the mercury and air toxic standards. You know, part of that proposal addresses monitoring requirements for particulate matter from the regulated power plants. And when we looked at those provisions that were currently in the mercury and air toxic standards, we thought it was reasonable to propose basically that we require the use of continuous monitoring systems, you know, for that pollution across the board because it's cost effective and it's very effective in providing assurance on a continuous basis that those standards are being met. But that's just another example on the stationary source side of how these technology advancements are making it possible to assure compliance, you know, more effectively than ever before, and how important that is in terms of how we design our programs.
Great. I feel obligated now to plug the fact that Cynthia Giles, a former head of enforcement at EPA, has a whole book about how regulations need to be designed with compliance in mind.
And she is part of our team at the Office of Air and Radiation.
Yes, of course.
Okay, Kevin, based on your mic's going to cut again. I don't know who will do it this time. Based on your experience with the clean power litigation, how legally durable do you think the proposed power sector regs will be with respect to CCS and low GHG hydrogen co-firing?
Oh, this is easy. I think I already previewed my response on that I think all of the deficiencies that the Supreme Court saw in the Clean Power Plan, none of those are present here. There, what the Supreme Court said EPA did wrong is they devised, in their mischaracterization, a cap on the amount of coal-fired generation. They arbitrarily decided how much coal-fired generation should exist and then set standards premised upon that, not upon any objective criterion. Here, what EPA has done is they've set standards that are premised exactly upon the amount of reduction you can get at an individual source by using cleaner fuels or by capturing the CO2. And they make a lot, EEI, I'm responding again, make a lot about the fact that carbon capture isn't used broadly in the power sector today, but that's no different than other types of technologies, scrubber technologies, that weren't used in one sector and EPA said could be used. When EPA required SCRs, those are selective catalytic reduction systems for industrial boilers, they had never been used at all on industrial boilers, but they were used on utility boilers doing the same thing. And so we've got CCS out there. It exists today. The same technology exists. And so, premising a standard upon that is well in line with what is achievable. And so my view is that all of what the Supreme Court saw is wrong, that EPA is seizing the power sector, that it is transforming its authority in ways that weren't contemplated by Congress. That's absent in this case. And so my hope is that we get a decision of a DC circuit that affirms whatever decision, if it looks like what EPA has proposed, a decision that affirms that, and the Supreme Court says, we don't need to take a look at this. This is not a quote-unquote extraordinary case. This is just like any other air pollution challenge over 50 years of the Clean Air Act.
Thank you, Kevin. So either of the EPA folks could answer this. We got a question. I can't find the card right now, but my memory is that the question was about the tight timeline for some IRA funding opportunities and the difficulty that frontline communities face in accessing those funds within the necessary timeline. What is EPA doing to ensure that frontline communities have a fair chance at those funds?
So let